Okay, welcome to Anatomy 1. Our first chapter is going to be Chapter 1, and it's going to be some basic things about anatomy, kind of the history of anatomy, and then like random definitions. So hang with me. You should have your fill in the blank PowerPoint, and you can use that to take notes from this lecture. You can print it and write in the answers, or flip back and forth electronically. So a long time ago, they used healing and they healed people by magic and superstitions. And we started looking at anatomy as we started trying to heal these wounds and injuries. And they would even explore dead bodies. A real good book to read is called Stiff by Mary Roach, and there's a couple chapters on the history of anatomy and body stealing and how they'd use criminals and actually be kind of a show you'd pay to come watch, and they would pretty much dissect the criminals alive. It wasn't always nice, but now we're moving away from cadaver dissections and going towards electronic cadaver dissection. So that's new. And then this is like an illustration from 1543 looking at the muscles of the body. So what is anatomy? You'll need to know this for the test. So you can star this slide or highlight this information if you have a highlighter in your house or wherever you're at watching this video. Pause this video now and go grab it. Anatomy, you want to highlight that. You're going to need to know it. The study of structure. So what it's made of, what it looks like, the shape, the components, the names of the parts, all of that is anatomy. And it comes from the root word tome, which means to cut. Physiology is how those parts function. Usually that's the harder part of anatomy, and physiology is the physiology because it's looking at the chemistry and the physics of the thing. Anatomy is more memorization, where physiology is more understanding. And so I hope to help you with both of those in this course. The structure of an organ always determines the function. Think about a shoe. It has a specific structure so that it functions as a shoe. If you changed the structure and added wheels to the bottom of it, it would no longer be a shoe. It might be a roller skate. And so you change the structure and now it functions differently. Sorry. So you'll need to know these levels of organization. We'll talk about these multiple times throughout the semester. So learning it once will help you later on. So we're going to look at subatomic particles in this unit, protons, neutrons, electrons, that make up atoms. The prefix sub, like a submarine, goes under the water or the ocean. So sub means below. So if you look at an atom, the smallest particle of matter, a subatomic particle is smaller than an atom. So atoms are made of protons, neutrons, electrons, and we call those subatomic particles. Atoms come together to form molecules, such as water. So you take two hydrogens and atoms and one oxygen atom, and you put a few atoms together and you have a molecule of water. And glucose would be 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens to make one molecule of glucose. Put a few molecules together or larger number of atoms and you have macromolecules, and we'll actually study these in a little bit of detail. Proteins are macromolecules. Nucleic acids like DNA and RNA are macromolecules. We're going to have polysaccharides and even some fats as macromolecules. And what we do with those macromolecules is we organize them, right? Think of anatomy. We put them together in a certain way, and that can build organelles. And so we're talking about lysosomes, nucleus, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, all that stuff from biology. We're going to bring it back here in Unit 1. It's called organelle because L means little. So it's like a little organ for the cell. It has a specific job, a specific structure because of its function. And then those organelles can come together and make up a cell. And I want you to star cell. This is the smallest unit of life. So organelles are not considered living. Macromolecules are not considered living. Anything below cell is not living. So all those things we've talked about so far. Once you talk about cells, those are the first time we can say something is living. And it is the basic structure and function of all living things. There's the cell theory. All living things are made of cells. Cells come from other cells, and cells are the basic unit of life. You put a group of cells together that have a common purpose, and they're called a tissue. And so this could be a single layer of cells or a group of cells, and that's like adipose tissue, which is fat. One of my kind of least favorite ones. Put some tissues together and organize that anatomy, and they will function as an organ, like your heart or stomach, kidney, liver, or even your skin. Take the organs that have a common function and put them together, and we have an organ system. So integumentary system, digestive system, reproductive system, just to name a few. And put all of those systems together, and what do you have? You have the human body, the organism, which we're studying, human anatomy. So you should be able to say this is the smallest thing, and a few of these, protons, neutrons, electrons, make one of these, and a few of these make one of these, and a lot of the atoms make a big. Macro means big. So remember, micro is small, so macros, large molecules. Put these together and make an organelle. Use a bunch of organelles together and you have a cell. A group of cells together is tissues. A group of tissues are organs. A group of organs are organ systems. And a group of organ systems make up the organism. Know it from small to large, but be careful because the test could ask large to small. The questions could say organs are made out of, and you would need to know tissues. Organs make up organ systems. So be careful to the wording of those questions. And here's a visual for you, the one little atom. Now we can't see the protons, neutrons, and electrons. Electrons will be floating around here. Protons and neutrons in the nucleus of this atom. But you take a few of these atoms, put them together. This is looks like a water molecule. You can take a lot of atoms and build a macromolecule. Take a bunch of macromolecules and make organelles, and eventually this is one cell, believe it or not. This cell is not what you would normally think to be the shape of a cell, but here's the nucleus, and there's mitochondria and cytoskeleton inside. Put a bunch of these cells together and you have a tissue. This is a type of muscle tissue, and you can see the nuclei in these individual branched, funky shaped cells. Take those tissues along with other tissues like adipose and endothelium or epithelial tissue, and you have an organ like the heart. And we know the heart doesn't work alone. It has arteries and veins and capillary beds, so that would be the system. And then we don't just have one system, we have many systems that make up the body. Fun fact, you've probably heard of an ultrasound or an MRI, and these are ways we can look inside without cutting. Thank goodness, right? So ultrasound, it's ultra because it's a high frequency sound wave, and what it does is those bounce off the images of what's inside and gives you a picture. And this is one example how we look at a fetus in the uterus. And then MRI bounces electrons at the body, and atoms absorb those or bounce them at and provide an image for you. So here are just some key concepts, some core themes for anatomy. You need to know that all living things are made of cells, that you have an environment within the body, you have an external environment outside the body, and your body actually responds to both of those through a process called homeostasis. Homeostasis, think about stay the same. It's a constant internal environment. So you should be thinking about like your temperature doesn't change all that much. There's an interdependency of cells. So cells depend on each other. They communicate with one another and work together a lot. Think about a tissue, right? It's a group of cells. And then we know that structure and function are interrelated. If you change the structure, you change the function. So think about somebody who's born with a messed up structure of blood. The function of that blood is going to also be messed up. Now, not all mutations are bad. For example, there was a mutation a long time ago in my ancestor that allowed me to keep an enzyme active that breaks down lactose. And so because of that, I'm able to eat cheese and ice cream, and some of my favorite foods are dairy products. So if you're like me and can eat those things, you have a mutation for lactase. And if you're lactose intolerant, your ancestors didn't get that mutation, or you somehow lost that mutation. Some more core themes. This is just continuing. There's something called gradients. Now, underline gradient. I always think of a gradient as like a hill. So this is the same thing as slope. So picture a hill. You might draw a little hill out to the side. And then permeability means the ability to permeate something, to go through something. So pretty much everything moves from high to low by itself. So heat moves from hot temperatures to cold temperatures. Water is going to move from where there's more water to where there's less water. Perfume, when sprayed, is going to move from where there's a high concentration of that perfume to lower areas. And so we would say that goes down the concentration gradient. Even pressure, things move from high pressure to low pressure. So we're going to see that trend, that theme throughout anatomy. And things are always moving across permeable membranes. Remember, that's able to permeate. You have permission to cross. Now, some membranes are impermeable to some things, and so sometimes they call them semi-permeable because they let some things through and not others. Not all cells are exactly the same. We just saw a picture of a funky branch-shaped cell with like stripes on it, and so your cells are all a little bit different. Now, all of your cells have the exact same DNA in them, but the reason they're different is because of the genes being expressed in those cells. The cell membrane, we're going to find out, is very important because it determines what can come into the cell and exit the cell. It also allows the cell to respond to signals and communicate with other cells, which is why we see cell-to-cell communication. Feedback loops, oh my gosh, star that. That is how we maintain homeostasis. Balance is we've got to replace anything lost. So if you're losing a lot of water, you become dehydrated and you need to replace the water that you lost. And if you have too much water, right, you need to get rid of any excess. So you might have more urination. And then there's energy processes in cells. And this is what keeps cells alive. If you don't have energy, the cell dies, the tissue dies, the organ system dies. Eventually, the organism can die. All right, there's a few characteristics of life. So this is not key themes or core ideas, but these are what we see all life have, these characteristics of all living things like plants, animals, fungi, you name it. So, and we'll talk about humans because that's what we're focusing on, but we grow. And so what that can mean is we're growing in body size, but we're doing this by increasing our cell number. And so actually the second bullet, reproduction, well, cells reproduce to help us grow, but they're also talking about we can reproduce by making whole new organisms like a baby. We are responsive to our environment, both internal environments and external environments, and we react to those. And then we can change our body position and location. And maybe you're thinking plants can't do that. But if you've ever looked at a sunflower, it moves quite a bit following that sun. And don't forget, it's not just moving like your arms and legs, but it's also moving food into your stomach and waste out of your body. All living things have some sort of metabolism. Star that word, you need to know it. It is all of the chemical reactions that happen in your body. And so a lot of people talk about having a high metabolism, and that just means you're doing a lot of chemical reactions, and it produces a lot of energy. I think of like children usually. As you age, this metabolism, these chemical reactions kind of slow down, and you don't have as much energy, and you tend to store that as fat. We all respire, and respiration is where you use oxygen to burn the food products in the body. So this food allows us to have energy, and our waste product of doing that is carbon dioxide. We do some sort of digestion where we break down food into usable nutrients. Circulation is to move the chemicals through both cells and throughout the body fluids. And then get rid of waste is excretion. So what do organisms require? Just some main few things: water, food, oxygen, heat, and pressure. And water is probably the most important thing. Besides oxygen, you'll die pretty quickly if you don't have oxygen. But water is the most abundant thing in your body. And what it does is provides an environment for all those chemical reactions to take place. It allows transportation of substances, and water has the natural ability to hold heat. You know this if you've ever boiled water. It took a lot of energy to get it boiling, right? You're sitting there watching, and then you can go shower after you've boiled your water and do some chores, and you come back and that water is still hot. It's still warm because it holds temperature very well. Of course, we need food because that's where we're going to get our energy from, and we need oxygen to burn that food. We talk about burning calories. The more oxygen you take in, the more calories you can burn. Now, don't, pass out or anything, but if you work out, guess what? You'll breathe more, and then you'll burn more calories. It's crazy. And you think about a candle needs oxygen to burn, so does our food. And so you can kind of see this intracellular. So intra means inside cells. So this would be inside a cell. This section right here would be inside a cell. You see the nucleus. These are cells, so you can look inside those cells. And then extracellular fluid is outside the cells. Now this is inside a blood vessel. So this would be plasma, the extracellular fluid of blood, or the matrix of blood. So we need some heat, and we usually do that ourselves by burning our food. Our metabolic reactions provides heat for us, and it helps maintain our body temperature. And then pressure is any application of force on an object, and you're constantly feeling atmospheric pressure, which we'll find out in Anatomy 2 is important for breathing. Hydrostatic pressure helps keep not just blood flowing, but fluids flowing. And so that's also important in cells. So star this slide because there is a lot on homeostasis. Remember that homeostasis is how we stay the same inside. It's a stable internal environment. And there's three parts of this mechanism, this self-regulating mechanism that's constantly looking inside and seeing if something's out of those parameters and checking it and correcting it. The receptor is what detects that information. So maybe it's too high blood sugar. So you're going to have receptors that say, oh my gosh, the blood sugar is way too high. That cell will communicate to the control center. And the control center will talk to the effector cell to change that. So it will be to, in this case, if you have too high blood sugar, your control center will be your endocrine system, which can release insulin. And then insulin is going to communicate to the effector cells to take sugar in out of the blood, and that's going to lower our blood sugar. So here's some stimulus is received by receptors. The change is determined, how we need to respond. And then the effectors can be either muscles, like if you need to move, or, like I mentioned, glands, to respond to that and correct what is out of whack. Now, most of homeostasis happens by negative feedback. This is the most common mechanism for keeping our internal conditions stable. And so what happens is these effectors are going to return the conditions more towards normal range and and not allow us to deviate too much from a set point. So you should have a set amount of sugar, and you don't want to deviate from that. Your sugar will go high after a meal, and your body responds by lowering it. Your sugar will go low when you're fasting, and your body will respond to that. And that's called negative feedback, because the response is in the opposite direction of the the original I just lost stimulus. Sorry. So this will not have sudden, severe changes in the body. They are slow to correct themselves. And so we see this with your body temperature. If you get too cold, think about how your body reacts to when you're too cold. What do? I hope you didn't say go get a jacket, even though that is a response. But you like shiver, right? And that shivering warms your body up. It goes opposite of being too cold. I already mentioned blood sugar. If your levels go up, you'll release insulin. If your level go down, you'll release glucagon. And it's all about maintaining a set amount. And the same thing with blood pressure or blood calcium, water content. A lot of things are controlled by negative feedback. And so that's what's the most common one. So here they're showing how room temperature, you have a thermostat that detects that and controls it. And then you have your compared to your body temperature. So if the room gets hot, the thermostat detects that. And what does it do? It turns the heat off. It might turn the air on and cool the temperature of the room. But if the temperature gets too low, it turns that air conditioner off and turns the heat on, and you come back to this range, this normal range. You don't want to go too high, don't want to go too low, but we're constantly, right? The room is constantly deviating a little bit from that set point. Well, the body does the same thing. And so, like I said, if you get too hot, your brain realizes that, and it tells the skin to dilate blood vessels so that that's why you turn red, because remember, blood is made of mainly water, and water holds heat. So if we can get that heat close to the skin, the heat will leave our body. We're going to start to sweat because you get rid of water, and remember, water holds heat. And what will that eventually do? That'll cool us down. But have you ever sweated so much you got cold? I have, and your brain's like, wait a minute, don't sweat anymore. And now you constrict your blood vessels, so you're not going to be red in the face anymore. And your muscles start to, move and shiver to help you form heat. So this is all negative feedback examples. Now, a few times in the body, we'll see positive feedback. And so this is pretty uncommon. And here, the change or the stimulus is intensified instead of reversed. And so this is going to usually be short-lived, and we move away from homeostasis. Even though it doesn't seem that it will eventually lead to homeostasis, it does. So examples of this is blood clotting and, oh my gosh, my favorite, uterine contractions of childbirth. Let's talk about that one for just a second. As the baby starts to put pressure on the uterus, that pressure is the stimulus. It tells the brain, hey, there's pressure. And instead of releasing the pressure, it actually contracts the muscle, which causes what? More pressure. More pressure to the brain says contract a little harder. And you have what? More pressure. And more pressure. And contract harder, more pressure. And faster contraction. Oh my God. And then eventually you have the baby and there is no pressure. Oh, you're back to homeostasis. Relief. Blood clotting works the same way, except it's not as dramatic. So these are some illustrations of the positive feedback. So if you want to pause the video and read through those, that could be helpful. So we see that organ systems work together to maintain homeostasis. So like your digestive system will help you take in nutrients, salts, and water, and that can go into the blood, which is part of the cardiovascular system. And also, as you use your muscles, they release CO2 in the blood, and other wastes which move between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. And then you have your urinary system. If you drank too much water, it's in the blood, will release it into the external environment. So this is like your body. Kind of weird picture of your body, right? And this is how we get things in and out and maintain stable environments. Okay. Fun part of anatomy is learning about the human body. So here we go. The axial portion of your body is the head, neck, and trunk. And so you might talk about the axial skeleton. They're talking about the bones of the head, neck, and trunk. This word comes from axis. So think about the earth spinning on the axis is that line down the middle. So it's your head, neck, and trunk. Everything attached to that axis is appendages, so they call it appendicular portion. So that's going to be your arms and your legs, and the things that hold those parts onto the axis. You'll also need to know for the test the major body cavities. You'll have to label those through a picture. And so there's the cranial cavity found in your head. It holds your brain. Your vertebral canal or cavity, sometimes called spinal cavity, holds your spinal cord. It does not hold your vertebrae. Your vertebrae are around this cavity. Remember, a cavity is just a space, right? So the space in your head is your cranial cavity. The space through the vertebra is your vertebral canal or spinal cavity. The thoracic cavity, thoracic means chest. So this is your chest cavity where you're going to have your lungs, and then you have your abdominopelvic cavity, which has the viscera or organs of the abdomen and pelvis. So when we look at this, we're also going to notice the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm is a key muscle, especially when we're doing dissections, because it easily tells you where the thoracic cavity ends and the abdominopelvic cavity begins. So it's a division between those two cavities. You're also going to want to know mediastinum. This is between your lungs in the thoracic cavity, and it's where your heart is, and part of your esophagus, trachea, and the thymus gland is located. Now, abdominopelvic cavity is actually two cavities kind of combined. There's the abdominal cavity, which is the topper part of that. It's right below the diaphragm, right? If we went above the diaphragm, we'd be in thoracic cavity. So right below the diaphragm, we have our abdominal cavity, where most of our intestines are, our stomach, things of the abdomen. And then your pelvic cavity is going to contain just a small portion of your large intestine as it leads to your colon, or sorry, I misspoke, as your large intestine leads to your rectum, and then you'll find your urinary bladder there and your reproductive organs. So let's look at those and be ready to label those on a test. So from that lateral view, we're going to learn those in a minute. Lateral means side. So we have our cranial cavity that holds our brain, our vertebral cavity. See how it's running down through the vertebra or the vertebrae, and so this is going to have the spine inside of it, which is nervous tissue. The thoracic cavity, our chest cavity, above this muscle of thin muscle of diaphragm, and then you have your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity together called the abdominopelvic. Now, if you look at this from a frontal view, you can see in this thoracic cavity, here's the mediastinum in the middle, and so this whole part that's outlined in dotted black is the mediastinum. So you can see that's where the heart's located, and thymus and other things we mentioned. And then this is going to be lungs. Anytime you see plural, that means lung. And so this is the space where the lungs are found. And then here's that diaphragm, again, that thin muscle that separates thoracic from abdominopelvic cavities. There are some small cavities in the head that aren't the cranial cavity, like the oral cavity, nasal cavity, orbital. Now, oral is mouth, nasal is nose. Most people get those. Orbital is actually your eye, and then middle ear cavities. So you can see here's the middle ear, and here's the nasal cavity in orange, and the oral cavity. And then you have sinuses that are spaces in bone that are usually filled with air. Unless you have a sinus infection, they're filled with fluid. And then here's these orbital cavities where the eyes are located. So there are some membranes associated with the thoracic and abdominopelvic organs, and this is tested probably more often than anything. So star this slide also. So there is a double layer of serous membrane. Take a piece of paper and fold it over. You've got a serous membrane that's doubled, right? And the membranes actually secrete what's called serous fluid between the two pages of your paper, between the two layers, and we call that serous fluid. Now, the two layers are found associated with the heart and your intestines and your lungs. And so the visceral, so these are going to be found around those organs that I just mentioned. The visceral layer is always covering an organ. Gosh, please learn that. And parietal layer is around, it's superficial to that. It's going to line the wall of the cavity. It's the outer layer. And so there's 3 of these examples in the body that we'll talk about. So the visceral, remember that's on the organ, and parietal pleura. Remember, pleura means what? Lungs. So the visceral pleura is on the lung. The parietal pleura is lining the cavity the lung is sitting in. Okay. The visceral pericardium, well, peri, around, like perimeter, cardi, heart. So visceral pericardium is actually on the heart, and the parietal pericardium is lining that mediastinum. The visceral peritoneum is right on the abdominopelvic organs, like your stomach, your intestines, and the parietal peritoneum is lining that cavity. So if we cut somebody, right here, and you looked down into them, so this is the back end of them. You can see the vertebra, and then this would be that spinal cavity. And so that's one cavity we've learned about. Okay, here's the heart. And do you see this light blue? That is the serous membrane. So think about you folding your paper and then wrapping it around the heart. And so if we look where my arrow's pointing, I hope you can see that. That is right on the heart. And so that's the visceral, and we're around the heart, pericardium. Okay. Now there's the space, the serous space, serous fluid's going to be in there, and they call that the pericardial cavity because it's the cavity between our two serous membranes. So this was visceral. That means this outer one is parietal, and it's lining this mediastinum that the heart is sitting in, this area. Okay, let's look at the lungs. Remember, the word for lung is pleura. So here's your folded paper. Okay, this serous membrane is the visceral pleura. Here's the pleural cavity and the parietal pleura. See how it's lining the inside of that space where the lungs are going to sit? And it's all the same tissue, it's just folded. It's kind of cool. Okay, let's look at the other example. So here are some intestines. You see some stomach and some part of the colon and other structures. And so this is lining that cavity. So that's the parietal, right? Peritoneum, peri around, toneum, I don't know, a lot of things, a ton of things. That's how you can remember it. So parietal peritoneum, the peritoneal cavity between the two serous membranes, and then this is the visceral peritoneum, the one that's sitting on top of all these organs, okay? And so those are our 3 examples of the serous membranes. Visceral and parietal, know where those are. Visceral always on the organ, parietal lining the cavity. And then we have pleura, which means lung, pericardy around the heart, and peritoneum around the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, in anatomy and physiology, once we get out of the first bit, we're learning about basic stuff. We're going to learn about cells and organelles and tissues. We finally get to like the organs and the organ systems. And so in Anatomy 1, we're going to learn the integumentary system, which is like hair, skin, and nails. We're going to learn about the skeletal system, which is like bones and joints, ligaments, things like that. We're going to learn about the muscular system. This is specifically skeletal muscles, so we'll be naming like rectus femoris and the obliques, abdominals, and the pectoralis majors and the frontalis. We'll be learning a lot of those muscle names. And then we'll end Anatomy 1 learning about the nervous system. So the central nervous system and then the peripheral nerves coming off of that. And that is where Anatomy 1 ends. Anatomy 2 picks up with the endocrine system, so making hormones, the cardiovascular system, so the heart and blood and all of that, the lymphatic system, like lymph nodes and how white blood cells help protect the body, so a little bit of immunity there, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the urinary system, and then the reproductive systems. And so it looks like a whole lot more systems in Anatomy 2, which is true, but you're learning a bunch of basic stuff in Anatomy 1 that you're going to use for both Anatomy 1 and 2. And this slide shows every organ system, what are the organs involved, and the major functions. I'm not going to test you on these things because we're going to have a whole test on integument. We're going to have a whole test on skeletal. We're going to have a whole test on muscle and a whole test on nervous. So save that for later, and then everything endocrine down would be Anatomy 2 material. So you do also need to learn about anatomical position. And the anatomical position is when you're standing straight up, facing forward, and your limbs are at your sides with your palms facing not your side, but forward. So it's not a resting position, but you're actually standing up with palms facing forward. And when we discuss the position of structures in the body, we are always assuming the person is standing in anatomical position. And so this is what that looks like. Now, also very important, this is this person's right arm. So this would be the right wrist and the left wrist, the right knee and the left knee. And so make sure you think about that kind of stuff, because on the test it's going to ask you to point to the right, femoral region. So where's the right femoral region? Well, femoral is the thigh. So which is the right? This side or this side? I hope you picked this because you're always talking about the person's right side. Now, if he was facing backwards, if he was not in an anatomical position, and we asked for his right calcaneal, it would be his heel, his right heel. And if he was turned around, it would be on your right because you're also facing the same direction. So make sure you know it's his right and his left on the test. You also need to learn relative position. So when we talk about something is superior, for example, your thoracic cavity is superior to your diaphragm muscle. That just means above. Inferior would be below. What cavity is inferior to the diaphragm? If you said abdominopelvic or abdominal cavity, you're right. Anterior or ventral means towards the front. Posterior or dorsal is toward the back. And I want to go ahead and warn you, in anatomy, they like to name things more than one way. And it's usually because some of the words are Latin based and some are Greek based. So you are learning a new language in a short amount of time. So you need to work every day practicing. So anterior or ventral is toward the front, posterior dorsal towards the back. Medial, well, you've heard of the median, like in the middle of the road. So that's the midline. So if your vertebra is medial to the body, so it's towards the midline. Lateral would be away from the midline or toward the side. Bilateral, the prefix bi means two, so this is two things, paired structures, and they're lateral, they're on both sides, where ipsilateral means the same side and contralateral means opposite sides. So you might be talking about the apex of the heart and the spleen are they bilateral, ipsilateral, or contralateral? Now, I'm not expecting you to know that yet, but if we went back to our guy and I said, the right wrist and the right ankle are what type of lateral? Well, they're not bilateral because they're not on both sides. I mean, the ankles are and the wrists are, but the wrist to the ankles are not bilateral. They are ipsilateral. They're on the same side. Now, the left wrist and the right ankle are contralateral on opposite sides. So it's just a way to communicate where things are located because you will need to do that in anatomy. The one that students struggle with the most is proximal and distal. Proximal is close to the point of attachment to the trunk, to the axial part of the body. And distal is further away. And I'm going to show you that on a person in a second. So star that one and make sure you know it because that is the one that students struggle with the most. Now, superficial is close to the body's surface. So your skin is superficial to the adipose tissue, and the muscle tissue is deep to the adipose tissue that's deeper to your skin. So it's a way to communicate again where things are located in reference to other things. So here we have superior toward the head, inferior away from the head, ventral or anterior towards the front, posterior or dorsal towards the back. And you probably heard of a dorsal fin that's found on like a shark or dolphin, and that means back. And you better watch your posterior because they're talking about watch your back. Lateral, away from the midline, medial, toward that midline. Of course, we know her right side and her left side. So what side is facing us here? It's her left side, okay? And is she in anatomical position? No, because she's not facing us. So this is the anatomical position. Now, distal and proximal, that's the one that people have the hardest time with. Proximal means close to attachment. So if we're talking about something, you're always talking about something on the arm or the leg. I've not ever heard that on the head. We'll use superior and inferior for head. So let's talk about her elbow and her wrist. Compare the elbow to the wrist. Which is closer to the attachment of the arm? Well, the arm's attached up here. So we would say the elbow is proximal to the wrist. It is closer to attachment than the wrist is. Oppositely of that, the wrist is further from attachment than the elbow, so it's more distal. Now, what about the fingertips? The fingertips are distal to the wrist, and now the wrist is more proximal than the fingertips. So that is proximal and distal. It works the same way on the leg. This area, the leg and the thigh. This is proximal, this is distal. Or if we're doing toes, this is distal and the ankle is proximal if you're comparing those two parts. If you're needing to go into the RT, you do want to know these body sections or planes. And I don't know who's going to RT or LPN or RN or PTA, but you're going to need to know these planes of the body. And so there is something called the sagittal section, and it is a longitudinal cut. It cuts right down the middle and cuts you into the left and right side. a lot of times you'll hear mid-sagittal, and that means equal left and right portions, so directly down the median. Parasagittal is a sagittal section that's lateral to the midline, so it's off center, and it's not going to form equal left and right portions. So that's the sagittal section. Transverse, or the horizontal section, divides the body into superior and inferior portions. So you can cut yourself. We saw a transverse cut when we were looking at the visceral and parietal serous membranes. Coronal, or frontal section, is what divides the anterior or ventral portions and the posterior or dorsal portions, so the front and the back. And so here's those body sections. So you can see we cut this poor guy right down the middle. Okay, so that would be a mid-sagittal cut. And when you look at it, you can see into the side of his body. So that's a mid-sagittal cut. Here we're cutting a frontal plane. And so when you cut him that way, you can look into the back of the knee, or in this case, the front of the knee. Okay. You can also cut this way, right? We're cutting superior from inferior. That's a transverse cut, and there you would see this kind of stuff. So this would be important for depending on how you want to look at the structures inside of the organism, and I think of x-rays and stuff like that. So here's sections of the brain, and this would be important if you wanted to use an MRI and look at this, different planes. So what is this one? Can you name them? So right down the middle, sagittal. This is the horizontal one called transverse. And then the frontal or coronal separates front and back. Now sometimes we have to cut objects that are more cylindrical, and so we call it a cross section, oblique section, or longitudinal section. And so here's a bone, here's a cross section. Oblique means at an angle, and then longitudinal. The abdominal regions and quadrants are very, very easy, specifically the quadrants. This is the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. Like anybody can, well, I say that and then somebody might miss it, but this is the right side, and this is the upper and the lower. This is the left side, and this is the upper and the lower. A little bit more difficult are the abdominal regions. Those are not too bad if you know some language. Where the navel is the umbilical region. Epi means above. So here you think about your stomach, epigastric, above it. Right hypochondriac region. Chondra means, I just lost the word, not skeleton, cartilage. So here's some cartilage. So it's right under this cartilage of the ribs. So the right hypochondriac region and the left hypochondriac region. Hypo is below, which is confusing because it's the upper one. So don't mess that up. Lateral, remember that means side. So this is the right lateral and the left lateral regions. Your pubic region is going to be down here. I'm glad they cut them off. And then you have your right inguinal region, your hip area, and your left inguinal region. And then pretty heavy tested and used throughout anatomy are these regions of the body. And so you do want to go ahead and memorize them. So cephalic is head, frontal is your forehead. We already learned orbital was eye. Otic is ear. We learned nasal is nose and oral is mouth. Buccal is cheek. Mental is chin. So think about if you're having a mental moment, you have to think. Some people touch their chin when they think. Cervical. Now, when you talk about your cervix, it is the neck. Now, the cervix of your, reproductive structure, you're thinking about the neck of the uterus. So this is the cervical region. Don't point to the female down here, okay? We're talking about the neck. Acromial is this little point on the shoulder, but so the arm is brachial, so think about, you don't want to break your arm. Remember anterior means forward, front. So this is the front, and cubital is this elbow. So that's antecubital is front of elbow. Look at the back, it's just cubital. So antecubital is this front part. And that might be important, right, as a nurse, because the nurse palpates that area quite often. Now, front, again, brachial. So this is the front arm, or we commonly call it the forearm. Your carpal, you've probably heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, that's your wrist. Palmar region is the palm, and digital's finger. And you can think about, when you give somebody your digits, you're giving them your number, and that's what you count with your fingers. Okay, let's go down this side. Your sternum, this is your chest bone, is the sternal region, and then you have your pectoral region. Your umbilical or navel is where your navel's located, umbilical region. We mentioned inguinal earlier, towards the hip, not on the hip, but towards the hip, this where the leg kind of creases towards the pubic region. So that's inguinal. Now the actual hip is the coxal region. The genital region is, of course, where the external genitalia are found. Your femoral region is where your femur is located, so the thigh. Your patellar is your kneecaps. Now the back of the knee is popliteal. I think about somebody popping me right there, and I'll tilt backward, popliteal. Crural is leg, sural is calf. So you'll want to know those. Tarsal, ankles. So a lot of people get carpal and tarsal confused. They do sound alike, but remember, carpal tunnel syndrome is from typing a lot. And then digits can be fingers or toes. Now pedal is the foot, and there's some parts of the foot. I mentioned calcaneal earlier, that's the heel. And then plantar is the sole of the foot. Maybe you've heard of plantar fasciitis, or plantar warts are found in the bottom. So if it were me, I'd make some note cards of the harder ones and learn them, because when you're tested, you are timed, and I'm expecting you to use your knowledge on the test, and so you won't be able to look a lot of stuff up very quickly. I want you to know it, right? Because you're gonna go do nursing or RT or PTA or Surg Tech, and there's board certifications where you have to learn this stuff. So star this part for sure, because you're going to be using this for the rest of our course. And that is all for chapter 1, and we will move to chapter 2 next.